When my mother called asking me to downplay my promotion because it might hurt my brother's feelings, I thought she was joking. She wasn't. Apparently, my success as a marketing director at 28 was making my 32-year-old brother feel inadequate about his part-time retail job. The same brother who had stolen my college fund manipulated our parents for years and convinced everyone I was the selfish one. But what I discovered next about our family's financial arrangements would change everything. Some truths are worth every uncomfortable conversation that follows. Hey everyone. Before we dive into this wild family drama, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. If you've ever dealt with family members who tried to dim your shine, hit that like button and subscribe for more real-life stories about standing up for yourself. Trust me, you'll want to see how this family revenge unfolds. The phone call came on a Tuesday evening while I was celebrating my promotion with takeout and a bottle of wine I had been saving. Serafina Valdez had just been named Senior Marketing Director at the fastest-growing tech startup in Austin, Texas, and I was feeling pretty good about my life choices. "Sarah, honey, we need to talk." Mom's voice carried that familiar tone of disappointment mixed with exhaustion that I had grown accustomed to over the years. "What's wrong now, Mom?" I asked, muting the Netflix show I had been barely watching. "It's about your brother. He's having a really hard time right now, and your success is making things worse for him." I nearly choked on my wine. "Excuse me. Marcus saw your LinkedIn post about the promotion, and he's been really down. You know how sensitive he is about his career situation." Sensitive. That was Mom's favorite word for my 32-year-old brother, who had never held a job for more than 6 months and still lived in our childhood home. The same brother who had convinced our parents to let him borrow my college fund when I was 17, promising to pay it back after his business venture took off. That was 11 years ago. "Mom, I worked my butt off for this promotion. I'm not going to hide my success because Marcus can't get his life together." That's exactly the attitude I'm talking about, Serafina. You've always been so competitive with your brother. Can't you just be happy with your accomplishments without rubbing them in his face? The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, with Mom painting me as the villain for posting about my achievement on social media. According to her, I should consider taking down the post, maybe even declining some of the congratulatory dinner invitations from colleagues, because it might make Marcus feel worse about himself. After hanging up, I sat in my apartment staring at the city lights through my floor-to-ceiling windows. This wasn't the first time I had been asked to make myself smaller for Marcus's comfort. In high school, I was told not to mention my acceptance to UT Austin because Marcus had been rejected. When I graduated summa cum laude, the family celebration was muted because Marcus had dropped out of community college that same semester. When I bought my first car at 23, I was criticized for being flashy, while Marcus was still borrowing Mom's sedan. But something about this conversation felt different. Maybe it was the wine, or maybe it was finally having enough distance from my family's dysfunction to see it clearly. But I decided to do some digging. I started with social media. Marcus's Facebook page was a masterpiece of manufactured sympathy. Posts about how hard it was to find work in today's economy, vague references to family members who didn't understand struggle, and plenty of shares about the importance of supporting family through difficult times. The comments were filled with sympathy from relatives and family friends, many of whom had contributed to various GoFundMe campaigns he had started over the years. That's when I remembered something. 2 years ago, Marcus had started a campaign to help with medical expenses after what he claimed was a workplace injury. He had raised over $8,000 from our extended family and family friends. But I distinctly remembered him posting photos from a vacation to Las Vegas just weeks later. I started making phone calls. Aunt Rebecca, who had contributed $500 to the medical fund, told me she had been wondering why Marcus never seemed to get better. Cousin David mentioned that he had seen Marcus working at different retail stores throughout the time he was supposedly too injured to work. Uncle Tom said he had always suspected something was off about Marcus's stories, but family loyalty had kept him quiet. The more I dug, the more the picture became clear. Marcus had been running small-scale scams on our family for years, the medical emergency that never required actual medical treatment, the car repair that he handled himself after collecting money for mechanic fees, the stolen laptop that he needed replaced for job searching, which looked suspiciously like the one he had been using all along. But the biggest revelation came when I called my parents' bank, pretending to inquire about setting up a similar account structure for my own future children. The customer service representative was helpful in explaining their family trust account, mentioning that it was wonderful how they had been able to support their son's endeavors for so long. Family trust account. I had never heard of any family trust account. When I pressed for more information, carefully avoiding saying anything that would raise red flags, I learned that my parents had been making monthly deposits into this account for the past 5 years. The amounts varied, but they totaled well over $60,000. $60,000. While I had been paying off student loans and working overtime to afford my small apartment, my parents had been funding what essentially amounted to Marcus's lifestyle maintenance account. The same parents who had told me they couldn't help with my education expenses because they needed to be fair to both children. I spent the next week in a fog of anger and disbelief. Every family dinner where I had been lectured about being more understanding of Marcus's situation. Every birthday where my gift had been modest, while Marcus received expensive electronics or vacation money. Every conversation where I had been painted as the successful, selfish daughter who needed to be more supportive of her struggling brother. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place when I ran into Mrs. Patterson, our former neighbor at the grocery store. She mentioned how proud she was of me for doing so well, despite having to work through college, while my brother got to focus on his studies with family support. "What do you mean?" I asked, my stomach already knowing the answer. "Well, your parents paid for Marcus's college, didn't they? I remember your mother mentioning that they were able to cover his expenses so he wouldn't have debt like most kids these days." My college fund hadn't been borrowed for a business venture. It had been transferred to pay for Marcus's education, an education he had squandered by partying and eventually dropping out, but not before my money had been spent on his tuition room and board. Standing in the cereal aisle of H-E-B, surrounded by the mundane normalcy of grocery shopping, I realized that my entire adult life had been shaped by a lie. I had worked 3 jobs through college, graduated with debt, and spent years building my career while being told I was privileged and selfish for not supporting my brother more. Marcus wasn't struggling despite family support. He was struggling because he had been enabled his entire adult life, funded by money that should have been mine and protected by parents who had rewritten history to make me the villain in their narrative. The anger that filled me in that moment wasn't the hot, impulsive rage of a moment's frustration. It was cold, calculating, and absolutely determined. If my family wanted to talk about fairness and support, I was about to give them a masterclass in both. The revelation about the family trust account changed everything. But I knew that emotional confrontations would only result in more gaslighting and manipulation. I had learned enough about Marcus's methods to know that I needed to be strategic, methodical, and completely prepared before making any moves. I took a week off work telling my new team that I needed some time to handle family matters. It wasn't entirely a lie. I was about to handle family matters more thoroughly than anyone expected. My first stop was a consultation with Elena Rodriguez, a family attorney who specialized in financial fraud cases. I had found her through a recommendation from a colleague who had dealt with a similar situation involving a sibling who had been stealing from their elderly parents. "What you're describing could potentially constitute several forms of financial manipulation," Elena explained after I laid out the entire situation. "The misrepresentation of your college fund's purpose, the ongoing financial support that was hidden from you, and the fraudulent fundraising campaigns all paint a picture of someone who has been systematically taking advantage of family relationships." She helped me understand my options. While some of Marcus's actions might not rise to the level of criminal fraud, they certainly constituted a pattern of deceptive behavior that had caused financial harm to both me and the extended family members who had contributed to his various schemes. "The challenge," Elena continued, "is that family financial arrangements can be complicated and emotional manipulation isn't always legally actionable. But if you can document the pattern of deception, particularly regarding the fundraising campaigns, you might have grounds for demanding restitution." I left her office with a clear plan. Documentation first, confrontation second, and consequences third. Over the next few days, I became a forensic accountant of my own family's dysfunction. I contacted every relative who had mentioned contributing to Marcus's various causes, carefully framing my questions as concern for his ongoing welfare rather than suspicion about his honesty. The picture that emerged was staggering. Marcus had collected money for medical bills that didn't exist, car repairs that were never performed, job training programs he never attended, and emergency situations that had somehow resolved themselves without explanation. Conservative estimates put his fraudulent collections at over $25,000 from extended family alone. But the most damaging evidence came from Marcus himself. His social media presence was a goldmine of contradictions. Posts about being unable to afford basic necessities published on the same days as photos from expensive restaurants. Claims about job searching, accompanied by check-ins at bars and entertainment venues during standard business hours. Most importantly, vacation photos and luxury purchases that coincided perfectly with his most successful fundraising campaigns. I screenshot everything, organized it chronologically, and created a comprehensive timeline that would make any prosecutor proud. The pattern was undeniable once laid out clearly. During this investigation, I also made a discovery that added a personal dimension to my motivation for justice. While going through old family photos to establish a timeline of Marcus's claims versus reality, I found a folder of documents in my childhood bedroom that my parents had apparently forgotten about. Among these papers was the original paperwork for my college fund, including contribution records from my grandparents' aunts and uncles who had specifically given money for my education. My grandmother had contributed over $10,000 in the 2 years before her death, with notes indicating that she wanted to ensure I could attend university without the burden of debt that she had experienced. Seeing her handwritten notes about wanting to help me achieve my dreams, knowing that money had been redirected to fund Marcus's party lifestyle, crystallized my resolve. This wasn't just about money anymore. It was about honoring the sacrifices and intentions of family members who had tried to help me succeed. But I also knew that simply presenting evidence wouldn't be enough. My parents had spent years perfecting the art of making Marcus's problems everyone else's responsibility. They would find ways to justify, minimize, or redirect blame away from their golden child. I needed leverage, and I found it in the most unexpected place: Marcus's current employer. Through some careful social media detective work, I discovered that Marcus was working at an upscale outdoor equipment store in downtown Austin. More importantly, he had been working there for almost 8 months, which contradicted his recent claims about being unable to find stable employment. But the real goldmine was discovering that his employee profile on the company website listed him as a brand ambassador and mentioned his entrepreneurial background. A little more digging revealed that Marcus had been presenting himself as something of a social media influencer to his employer, claiming that his various fundraising campaigns were actually successful marketing ventures that demonstrated his ability to build engaged communities around brands and causes. In other words, Marcus had turned his fraud into a resume enhancement. This gave me the perfect pressure point. Marcus's job depended on maintaining his fabricated image as a successful entrepreneur and community builder. If his employer discovered that his marketing campaigns were actually fraudulent fundraising schemes that had deceived family members, his employment would certainly be terminated. But more importantly, his future employment prospects in Austin's tight-knit marketing and retail community would be severely damaged. Austin's professional networks were smaller than many people realized, and reputation mattered enormously in building a career. I drafted several documents during this planning phase. First, a comprehensive report detailing Marcus's fraudulent activities, complete with evidence and estimated damages. Second, a timeline comparing his claims with documented reality. Third, a list of every family member who had been deceived along with the amounts they had contributed under false pretenses. But the document I was most proud of was a detailed financial analysis showing how Marcus's deceptions had impacted my own life trajectory. The student loans I was still paying off, the delayed home purchase because I couldn't save for a down payment while servicing educational debt, the career opportunities I had missed because I needed to prioritize income over professional growth during my early 20s. I calculated that Marcus's theft of my college fund had cost me approximately $80,000 in compound interest, delayed wealth building, and missed opportunities. That didn't include the emotional and psychological impact of growing up believing I was less deserving of family support than my brother. The final piece of my strategy involved timing. I knew that my family would be gathering for my cousin's wedding in 3 weeks. It would be the largest family gathering in over 2 years, with extended relatives traveling from across Texas and beyond. Many of these relatives had contributed to Marcus's various schemes over the years. More importantly, Marcus had already started laying the groundwork for his next fundraising campaign. He had been posting about needing money for professional development courses that would help him advance his career. Several relatives had already commented with offers of support. I decided that this wedding would be the perfect venue for Marcus's final performance as the struggling family member who deserved everyone's sympathy and financial support. It would also be the perfect venue for introducing the family to the real Marcus, backed by irrefutable evidence and delivered with the precision of someone who had spent 11 years learning from the master manipulator himself. The irony wasn't lost on me. Marcus had taught me everything I needed to know about strategic manipulation. He just hadn't expected me to use those lessons against him. The 3 weeks between my investigation and the wedding passed in a blur of careful planning and strategic relationship building. I knew that simply presenting evidence wouldn't be enough. I needed allies within the family who would support me when the inevitable backlash came. My first ally was surprisingly easy to secure. Uncle Tom, my father's younger brother, who had always been the family's unofficial financial advisor. When I called him under the pretense of seeking advice about family financial planning, he immediately picked up on my subtle questions about Marcus's various schemes. "Sarah, I've been waiting years for someone else to notice what I've been seeing," he said during our coffee meeting at a quiet cafe near his office in downtown Austin. "Your brother has been running game on this family since he was 20 years old, and your parents have been his biggest enablers." Tom revealed that he had been keeping his own informal records of Marcus's requests and claims, initially out of concern for my parents' financial security. "Your dad's retirement fund has taken a serious hit from all these emergency loans to Marcus. I tried talking to him about it last Christmas, but you know how defensive your mother gets about her baby boy." More importantly, Tom had documentation that I hadn't been able to access records of family financial discussions that had happened at gatherings I hadn't attended. Conversations where my parents had explicitly stated that they needed to support Marcus more than me because I was naturally more capable and didn't need as much help. "They literally said that you were strong enough to handle your own problems, so their resources should go to Marcus, who needed more support," Tom explained, his voice heavy with disgust. "I told them that wasn't fair or sustainable, but your mother accused me of not understanding what it meant to have a child who struggled." Through Tom, I learned about other family members who had been harboring similar concerns. Cousin Sarah, who worked in banking, had been suspicious about Marcus's financial claims for years, but had kept quiet to avoid family drama. Aunt Rebecca had stopped contributing to Marcus's causes after the medical emergency that never seemed to require actual medical treatment, but had continued to feel guilty about her skepticism. The most valuable ally, however, turned out to be someone I had never expected: Mrs. Patterson, our former neighbor, who had inadvertently revealed the truth about my college fund. When I contacted her directly to apologize for any awkwardness our grocery store conversation might have caused, she invited me over for coffee and a conversation that changed my entire approach. "Honey, I've been watching your family's dynamics for over 20 years, she said as we sat in her kitchen, surrounded by the comfortable clutter of a life well lived. "Your parents are good people, but they've been manipulated by someone who learned early that playing the victim gets results." Mrs. Patterson had perspective that family members couldn't provide. She had watched Marcus's patterns develop from childhood, seen how he had learned to weaponize his parents' love and guilt, and observed how the family had gradually reorganized itself around managing his constant crises. "The thing that broke my heart," she continued, "was watching you work yourself half to death through college, while your brother got to play the struggling artist role on your dime. Your grandmother would have been furious if she had known where her contributions actually went." She offered to write a letter detailing her observations over the years, providing an outside perspective that would be harder for my parents to dismiss as biased family drama. More importantly, she offered to be present at the wedding as a neutral witness to whatever confrontation was about to happen. Sometimes, families need an outsider to help them see what they've been too close to recognize, she explained. I'm too old to worry about making people uncomfortable when the truth needs to be told. With my alliance building complete, I turned my attention to the final phase of preparation, ensuring that Marcus would have maximum exposure when his house of cards collapsed. This required some careful manipulation of my own, which felt both satisfying and slightly dirty. I started by engaging with his latest fundraising narrative on social media. Marcus had been posting about needing money for professional development courses that would help him transition into a marketing career. The irony of him asking for money to enter the field where I had just been promoted wasn't lost on me. Instead of confronting him directly, I played the supportive sister role perfectly. I commented on his posts with encouragement, shared them to my own network, with notes about supporting family dreams, and even sent him a private message offering to help him research marketing programs in Austin. I'm so proud of you for taking charge of your career development. I wrote knowing that every word was being screenshot for future use. Let me know if you want me to introduce you to any of my colleagues in the marketing field. I'd be happy to help you network. Marcus responded with enthusiasm that bordered on relief. For the first time in years, his successful sister was not only supporting his efforts, but actively offering to help. He started sharing details about his plans, his financial needs, and his timeline for career transition that would all become crucial evidence of his deception. But the masterstroke came when I suggested that he should present his fundraising success as evidence of his marketing skills to potential employers. You've been so good at building community support for your various projects, I told him. That's exactly the kind of grassroots marketing skill that employers are looking for these days. Marcus loved this framing so much that he immediately updated his LinkedIn profile to highlight his community engagement and fundraising expertise, complete with metrics about the amounts he had raised and the response rates to his campaigns. He was literally advertising his fraud as professional qualifications. The wedding week arrived with Marcus more confident than I had ever seen him. He had successfully raised over $3,000 for his latest scheme, had received multiple job interview requests based on his updated LinkedIn profile, and was basking in the rare experience of having his sister's public support and encouragement. He had no idea that I had been documenting every interaction, saving every social media post, and building an airtight case that would destroy his credibility with surgical precision. The night before the wedding, I received a text from my mother that perfectly summarized the family dynamic I was about to shatter. I'm so proud of how you've been supporting your brother lately. This is the kind of family unity I've always wanted to see. Marcus is finally getting his life together, and having your encouragement has made such a difference. The guilt manipulation was still there, the implication that I had been withholding support that Marcus deserved, but there was also genuine happiness in her message. My mother truly believed that Marcus was finally on the right track, and that our family was healing from years of tension and misunderstanding. Part of me felt genuinely sorry for what I was about to do to her worldview. But a larger part of me remembered the 17-year-old girl who had been told that her college dreams were less important than her brother's immediate needs, the 22-year-old graduate who had been criticized for celebrating her achievements too enthusiastically, the 28-year-old professional who had been asked to dim her success to spare her brother's feelings. Tomorrow, at my cousin's wedding, in front of 3 generations of our family, Marcus would give his final performance as the misunderstood victim who deserved everyone's sympathy and support. And then I would give my own performance backed by 11 years of careful observation and 3 weeks of meticulous investigation. The difference was that my performance would be based entirely on documented truth, delivered with the precision of someone who had been taught by an expert manipulator how to build a compelling narrative that was impossible to ignore or dismiss. Marcus had spent years using family gatherings to reinforce his victim narrative and secure sympathy and financial support. This wedding would be the last time he had that opportunity. Justice, I was learning, required patience planning and perfect timing. Tomorrow I would finally have all three. The wedding reception was in full swing when I made my move. Marcus had spent the cocktail hour working the room. Like the seasoned manipulator, he was updating relatives on his career transition plans and graciously accepting their congratulations on finally getting his life together. Several family members had already approached me to comment on how wonderful it was to see Marcus thriving with my support. I waited until the moment between dinner and dancing, when everyone was relaxed from good food and wine, but still seated and attentive. The bride and groom had just finished their thank you speech, and the microphone was being passed around for anyone who wanted to share a toast or memory. "I'd like to say something about family," I announced, standing and accepting the microphone with a smile that had taken me years to perfect. The room settled into expectant quiet. Marcus beamed at me from across the room, probably assuming I was about to deliver some heartwarming speech about sibling bonds and second chances. Over the past few weeks, I've been thinking a lot about what family really means. I began, my voice carrying clearly through the elegant ballroom. About loyalty, honesty, and the responsibility we have to take care of each other. Nods and murmurs of approval rippled through the crowd. My parents looked emotional, probably thinking this was going to be the public reconciliation they had always hoped for. My brother Marcus has taught me so much about these values over the years. I continued making eye contact with him across the room. His smile faltered slightly at something in my tone, but he maintained his confident posture. "He's taught me that family members will always be there for you when you need help, like when he needed $8,000 for medical expenses after his workplace injury 2 years ago." I paused, letting that sink in. Of course, what made that situation so interesting was that he managed to recover completely without any medical treatment and actually used that recovery time to take a vacation to Las Vegas. The room went very quiet. Marcus's face had gone white, but I was just getting started. Or like last year when so many of you generously contributed to help him replace his stolen laptop that he needed for job searching. It was so thoughtful of everyone to help, especially since the laptop he claimed was stolen looked remarkably similar to the one he had been using all along. Uncle Tom was nodding slowly, his expression grim but unsurprised. Aunt Rebecca had her hand over her mouth, finally understanding why her contributions had never seemed to actually help Marcus get back on his feet. But Marcus has taught me the most important lesson about family through his current fundraising campaign for professional development courses. I pulled out my phone and opened the screenshots I had prepared. See, Marcus has been telling potential employers that his fundraising success demonstrates his marketing skills. He's actually listed these campaigns on his LinkedIn profile as evidence of his community engagement expertise. I looked directly at Marcus, whose confident facade was crumbling in real time. The thing is, when you tell employers that defrauding your own family members demonstrates your professional qualifications, that's not marketing expertise. That's just fraud with a resume. The silence in the room was deafening. I could see family members processing what I was saying, connecting dots they had never wanted to connect before. But the most important lesson Marcus taught me came when I discovered our family trust account. I turned to my parents, whose faces showed the dawning realization that their carefully hidden financial arrangements were no longer secret. See, while I was working 3 jobs through college and graduating with debt, our parents were depositing over $60,000 into an account specifically designed to support Marcus's lifestyle. The same parents who told me they couldn't help with my education expenses because they needed to be fair to both children. My mother started to stand, probably to interrupt or defend, but I continued before she could speak. The money for that account came from my college fund, the fund that our grandmother contributed to specifically for my education, with handwritten notes about wanting to help me succeed without debt. That money was transferred to pay for Marcus's college expenses, which he squandered by partying and eventually dropping out. The room was completely silent now. Several relatives were staring at Marcus with expressions ranging from shock to disgust. Others were looking at my parents with confusion and disappointment. So when my mother called 3 weeks ago to tell me that my success was making Marcus feel bad, and that I should consider hiding my achievements to spare his feelings, I realized that I had spent my entire adult life being gaslit by experts. I walked closer to Marcus's table, my voice remaining calm and measured, despite the rage I felt coursing through my veins. "Marcus, you've taught me that some people will lie to their own family members for money. You've taught me that manipulation can become so sophisticated that even the people being manipulated will defend their abuser. And you've taught me that enabling someone's destructive behavior doesn't help them, it just makes them better at being destructive." Marcus finally found his voice. "Sarah, you're misunderstanding the situation. I can explain everything. Can you explain why you told Aunt Rebecca that your medical emergency was ongoing while posting vacation photos on social media? Can you explain why you've been working full-time for 8 months while telling family members that you can't find stable employment? Can you explain why you've collected over $25,000 from our relatives for emergencies that never actually existed?" The numbers hit the room like physical blows. $25,000 represented significant sacrifices from family members who had trusted Marcus's claims and wanted to help during what they believed were genuine crises. Or maybe you can explain to your current employer how your community engagement and fundraising expertise actually consists of systematically defrauding the people who love you most. That was the killing blow, and Marcus knew it. His job, his reputation, and his future employment prospects in Austin's interconnected professional community were all hanging in the balance of this conversation. The beautiful thing about truth, I concluded looking around the room at 3 generations of our family, is that it doesn't require elaborate explanations or constant management. It just exists waiting for someone brave enough to speak it out loud. I handed the microphone back to the DJ and returned to my seat, leaving Marcus to face a room full of relatives who were finally seeing him clearly for the first time in years. The confrontation that followed was swift and devastating. Family members who had contributed to Marcus's schemes demanded explanations he couldn't provide. Uncle Tom publicly stated that he would be advising all family members to stop any financial support until Marcus made restitution for his fraudulent activities. My parents tried to minimize and redirect, but the documented evidence was overwhelming. More importantly, the family members who had been victimized by Marcus's schemes were angry enough to demand accountability rather than accept more excuses and deflection. Within an hour, Marcus had lost his family's financial support, his professional reputation, and his carefully constructed victim narrative. The golden child, who had spent years being protected and enabled, was finally experiencing the consequences of his choices. Justice, it turned out, tasted exactly like I had always imagined it would, sweet, satisfying, and long overdue. The aftermath of my wedding speech unfolded like dominoes falling in perfect sequence, each consequence triggering the next in a cascade that even I hadn't fully anticipated. Marcus fled the reception within minutes of my revelation, but not before Uncle Tom cornered him near the exit to inform him that he would be contacting every family member who had contributed to his schemes. "You've got 30 days to develop a restitution plan, or I'm filing a formal complaint with the Attorney General's office for fraudulent solicitation." Tom told him loud enough for nearby guests to hear. My parents' reaction was predictably defensive initially. Mom tried to frame my public exposure as a cruel attack on a family member who was already struggling, while Dad attempted to minimize the financial deceptions as misunderstandings rather than intentional fraud. But their deflection tactics fell flat when confronted with concrete evidence and angry relatives demanding answers. Aunt Rebecca was the first to break ranks with their narrative. "I gave that boy $500 for medical bills, and you're telling me he was posting vacation photos the same week. How exactly is that a misunderstanding?" she demanded, her voice carrying the particular fury of someone who had been made to feel foolish for their generosity. The family members who had been financially victimized by Marcus's schemes formed an impromptu coalition right there in the wedding reception hall. Cousin Sarah, with her banking background, volunteered to help document everyone's losses and research legal options for recovery. Uncle Tom offered to coordinate communication and ensure that Marcus couldn't continue his schemes with relatives who might not have been present for my revelation. But the most devastating blow came from an unexpected source, my cousin Jessica the bride, whose special day I had just hijacked with family drama. "Aunt Linda," she said to my mother, her wedding dress rustling as she approached our increasingly tense family huddle. "I need to tell you something that I probably should have mentioned years ago." Jessica went on to reveal that Marcus had approached her 6 months earlier with a sob story about needing money for job interview travel expenses. She had contributed $300 only to see him post photos from expensive restaurants and bars during the same time period he was supposedly traveling for interviews. "I didn't say anything because I didn't want to cause family drama, but I felt really stupid for believing him," she admitted. "When I heard Sarah's speech tonight, I realized that staying quiet just helped him hurt more people." Other family members began sharing similar experiences. Marcus had been running multiple overlapping schemes, telling different relatives different stories about his financial needs and career struggles. The pattern of deception was far more extensive than even I had realized during my investigation. The social dynamics shifted completely over the course of that evening. Family members who had spent years criticizing me for not being supportive enough of Marcus were now apologizing for not recognizing his manipulation sooner. Relatives who had felt guilty for questioning his stories discovered they weren't alone in their skepticism. Most importantly, my parents found themselves isolated in their defense of Marcus's behavior. When your entire extended family is presenting evidence of fraud and demanding accountability, it becomes much harder to maintain the fiction that your child is simply misunderstood. The professional consequences began even before the wedding reception ended. Marcus had made the mistake of connecting with several family members on LinkedIn as part of his effort to appear professionally networked and career-focused. When Uncle Tom shared my revelation on social media, tagging Marcus and including screenshots of his fraudulent fundraising campaigns, his professional network immediately had access to documentation of his deception. By Monday morning, Marcus's employer had terminated his position. The company's statement was brief but devastating. "We have a zero-tolerance policy for fraudulent activity, and misrepresenting criminal behavior as marketing expertise is fundamentally incompatible with our values and client relationships." The termination triggered a cascade of additional consequences. Marcus's apartment lease required employment verification for renewal, which he could no longer provide. His car loan had been co-signed by our parents, who suddenly found themselves responsible for payments they couldn't afford, given their own financial strain from years of supporting his schemes. But the most significant consequence was the complete collapse of his support network. My parents, faced with overwhelming evidence of his fraud and pressure from the extended family, finally acknowledged that their enabling had caused more harm than help. They announced that Marcus would need to find alternative living arrangements and that all financial support would cease until he made full restitution to the family members he had deceived. The restitution demands were substantial. Conservative calculations showed that Marcus owed over $28,000 to various family members, not including interest or the emotional damages caused by his systematic deception. With no job, no credit, and no family financial support, meeting those demands seemed impossible. Marcus's social media presence, once carefully curated to generate sympathy and support, became a liability. Screenshots of his fraudulent campaigns were being shared widely, tagged with warnings to other potential victims. His reputation in Austin's interconnected professional and social networks was permanently damaged. The justice was swift and comprehensive, but what surprised me most was how little satisfaction I felt in those immediate moments of his downfall. I had expected to feel triumphant, vindicated, or at least relieved. Instead, I felt something closer to exhaustion, mixed with sadness for the family relationships that had been irreparably damaged by years of deception and enabling. 3 days after the wedding, I received a phone call from Marcus himself. His voice was different, smaller, defeated, in a way I had never heard before. "I know you probably don't want to hear from me," he began, "but I needed to tell you that you were right, about everything." The conversation that followed was unlike any we had ever had. For the first time in our adult lives, Marcus spoke without manipulation, defensiveness, or attempts to redirect blame. He acknowledged the theft of my college fund, the fraudulent fundraising campaigns, and the years of financial manipulation that had shaped our family dynamics. "I don't know how to fix this," he admitted. "I don't even know where to start." That conversation marked the beginning of a different kind of ending than I had expected. Justice had been served, consequences had been delivered, and the truth had been exposed. But the real resolution would require something more complex than simple retribution. The golden child who had manipulated our family for years was finally facing reality without enablers or financial safety nets. Whether he would use that reality as motivation for genuine change or simply find new ways to avoid responsibility remained to be seen. But for the first time in my adult life, that outcome wasn't my responsibility to manage, predict, or enable. Marcus's choices were finally his own to make, and their consequences were his alone to bear. The family revenge I had planned had succeeded beyond my expectations. Now I had to figure out what came next. 6 months after the wedding confrontation, I sat in my newly purchased home office, looking out at the Austin skyline and reflecting on how dramatically my life had changed. The house itself was a symbol of the financial freedom I had finally achieved once I stopped subsidizing my family's dysfunction and started prioritizing my own goals. The restitution process had been lengthy and complicated, but ultimately successful. Marcus had been forced to liquidate his possessions, take multiple jobs, and enter into a formal repayment agreement supervised by Uncle Tom and Cousin Sarah. The legal pressure and family accountability had motivated a work ethic that none of us had seen from him before. More importantly, the family dynamic had fundamentally shifted. My parents, faced with irrefutable evidence of Marcus's manipulation and their own enabling behavior, had reluctantly entered family therapy. The process was difficult and often uncomfortable, but it was the first time in years that honest conversation was possible without Marcus's crisis management derailing every interaction. "We spent so many years trying to save him that we forgot we were hurting you," my mother admitted during one particularly difficult conversation. I thought being a good mother meant protecting the child who struggled more, but I realize now that we were just teaching him that struggling got better results than succeeding. The admission didn't immediately heal years of resentment and disappointment, but it was a starting point for rebuilding our relationship on more honest foundations. My parents began making their own restitution efforts, not just financial, but emotional, as they worked to understand how their choices had shaped both of their children's adult lives. Marcus himself had surprised everyone, including me, with his response to facing real consequences for the first time in his adult life. Without the safety net of family financial support and forced to confront the damage his choices had caused, he had begun making genuine efforts at accountability and change. The transformation wasn't immediate or dramatic. Real change never is, but it was consistent. He maintained steady employment, made his restitution payments on schedule, and stopped the manipulative social media campaigns that had characterized his online presence for years. Most significantly, he had apologized to each family member individually, acknowledging specific harms and expressing understanding of how his actions had affected their trust and financial security. "I spent so many years being angry that you succeeded when I couldn't," he told me during one of our monthly check-in calls that had become part of his accountability process. "I thought your success somehow took something away from me, instead of realizing that I was choosing not to put in the work that success requires." These conversations were still awkward and sometimes painful, but they represented the first honest communication we had shared since childhood. Marcus was learning to take responsibility for his choices without expecting immediate forgiveness or restored trust. I was learning to separate my anger about his past behavior from my hope for his future growth. The extended family had also evolved in positive ways. The crisis had forced us to examine our own patterns of enabling and boundary setting. Family gatherings became more authentic and less performative, with people feeling free to address problems directly rather than avoiding conflict to maintain artificial peace. Uncle Tom had emerged as an unofficial family financial advisor, helping relatives establish healthier boundaries around money and support. Aunt Rebecca had started an informal family policy requiring documentation and verification for any financial assistance requests. Cousin Sarah had used her banking expertise to help several family members improve their financial literacy and planning. The wedding confession had created ripple effects throughout our social network as well. Several family friends had reached out to share their own stories of being deceived by charismatic manipulators, and some had used my example as inspiration to address their own family dysfunction. Mrs. Patterson, our former neighbor who had inadvertently triggered my investigation, had become an unexpected mentor and friend. Her outside perspective on family dynamics had been invaluable during the most difficult months of rebuilding relationships and establishing new boundaries. The hardest part about family manipulation, she had explained during one of our coffee conversations, is that the people doing the manipulating aren't evil. They're usually just people who learned early that certain behaviors get results, and they keep using those behaviors until someone finally refuses to participate. This perspective had helped me understand my parents' enabling behavior and Marcus's manipulative patterns as learned responses rather than character defects. It didn't excuse the harm they had caused, but it made forgiveness and rebuilding possible in ways that pure anger never could have. My professional life had also flourished without the constant drain of family crisis management. The promotion I had celebrated 6 months earlier had led to additional opportunities and recognition. More importantly, I had learned to celebrate my achievements without guilt or the need to minimize them for other people's comfort. The money I had previously spent on student loan payments was now going toward investments, travel, and experiences that enriched my life rather than simply managing the consequences of other people's poor choices. For the first time in my adult life, my financial planning was focused on building wealth, rather than managing debt created by family dysfunction. I had also developed new friendships and professional relationships based on mutual respect and shared interests, rather than family obligation or crisis management. My chosen family of friends, colleagues, and mentors provided the support and encouragement that I had spent years trying to extract from biological family members who were too caught up in their own dysfunction to offer genuine emotional support. The most unexpected outcome of the entire experience had been discovering my own capacity for strategic thinking and boundary enforcement. Growing up in a manipulative family system had taught me skills I never realized I possessed: the ability to see through emotional manipulation, document patterns of behavior, and present evidence in ways that were impossible to dismiss or deflect. These skills had proven valuable in my professional life as well. Marketing at its core involves understanding human psychology and motivation. My experience navigating family manipulation had given me insights into consumer behavior and persuasion that my colleagues found remarkably sophisticated. As I finished writing the thank you notes to family members who had supported my decision to expose Marcus's fraud, I realized that the revenge I had planned had evolved into something much more meaningful than simple hatred. It had become a catalyst for authentic family healing and personal growth that none of us could have achieved while maintaining the old patterns of deception and enabling. The justice I had sought was ultimately less about punishment and more about truth-telling, creating space for honest relationships by refusing to participate in manipulative dynamics, choosing accountability over artificial peace, prioritizing long-term healing over short-term comfort. Marcus was still paying his restitution and would be for several more years. My parents were still in therapy, working to understand how their choices had shaped our family dysfunction. The extended family was still learning to balance support with accountability. But for the first time in my adult life, these family relationships were based on choice rather than obligation, honesty, rather than manipulation, and genuine care rather than crisis management. The golden child who had spent years taking advantage of family loyalty was finally learning to earn the support he received. The successful daughter who had spent years being told she was selfish for thriving was finally free to build the life she had always wanted. Sometimes the sweetest revenge is simply refusing to participate in your own oppression and creating space for everyone to become the people they are capable of being. Have you ever had to choose between family peace and personal justice? How did you find the courage to speak up when everyone expected you to stay quiet? Share your experiences in the comments below. I'd love to hear how you've handled family drama and manipulation in your own life. If this story resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe for more real-life stories about family dynamics, personal growth, and finding the strength to stand up for yourself. Share this video with anyone who might need to hear that they don't have to sacrifice their own success to make others feel better about their choices. Thank you for listening to my story and for supporting authentic conversations about the complicated realities of family relationships. Remember that you deserve relationships based on respect and honesty, not manipulation and guilt. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for your family is refuse to enable their worst behaviors. Keep choosing growth over comfort, truth over peace, and authentic relationships over comfortable dysfunction. I'll see you in the next video.